It began the night the stars refused to stay still. Marcus Webb had been driving trucks for 32 years, hauling everything from timber to electronics across the American West, and he thought he'd seen every kind of sky the continent had to offer. Desert sunsets that painted the horizon in shades of fire, mountain dawns where fog clung to valleys like something alive, storm systems rolling across the plains with lightning that made the earth itself seem fragile. But he'd never seen stars move. It was late March, past midnight, and Marcus was 3 hours into a solo run from Boise to Salt Lake City, carrying a load of agricultural equipment through empty Nevada darkness. The highway stretched before him like a ribbon of gray cutting through absolute black, his headlights the only illumination for miles in any direction. No other vehicles, no towns, just the steady rumble of diesel engine and the hypnotic white lines disappearing beneath his wheels. He'd been alone for most of his adult life by choice rather than circumstance. There had been a wife once, Sharon, but the marriage had lasted only 4 years before the road claimed more of his attention than she could tolerate. No children, no family beyond a sister in Oregon he hadn't spoken to in a decade. The solitude suited him, or so he'd told himself for long enough that it had become true. But lately, something had shifted. An emptiness he couldn't name had been growing in the spaces between breaths, a sense that his life had become nothing but movement without destination, miles accumulated without meaning. He was 56 years old, and when he tried to remember what he'd been working toward all these years, he found nothing but blank space where purpose should have been. Marcus glanced up through the windshield at the night sky, a habit formed from thousands of lonely hours behind the wheel. And that's when he saw it. The stars were moving. Not the slow, predictable rotation of the celestial sphere, but deliberate motion, specific points of light shifting position relative to their neighbors, tracing patterns that had no basis in astronomy or physics. He blinked hard, thinking exhaustion was playing tricks on his vision, but when his eyes opened again, the movement continued. 3 stars in particular drew his attention. Bright ones, forming a triangle that was slowly rotating, tightening, converging toward a single point directly ahead of his truck. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his foot easing off the accelerator, without conscious decision. The rational part of his mind offered explanations. Satellites, aircraft, some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, but none of them fit what he was seeing. The 3 points of light merged into one, and that single star began to descend. Marcus pulled the truck onto the shoulder, the air brakes hissing as 18 wheels ground to a halt on loose gravel. He killed the engine, and in the sudden silence, he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The descending light grew brighter, closer, its color shifting from white to pearl to something that had no name in any spectrum Marcus knew. He should have been terrified. Every instinct screamed at him to restart the truck and drive, to put distance between himself and whatever was approaching. But instead, he found himself climbing down from the cab, boots crunching on gravel, standing in the Nevada darkness, as the light settled to earth perhaps 50 yards from the highway. It wasn't a craft in any conventional sense. No metallic hull, no visible means of propulsion, no structure that obeyed the rules of engineering Marcus understood from decades of maintaining diesel engines and hydraulic systems. It was more like solidified light, geometry that existed in 3 dimensions but suggested others, surfaces that seemed to shift and reconfigure when viewed from different angles. A section of the light structure thinned, became transparent, and something emerged. The being that stepped through was humanoid enough to prevent immediate panic, but alien enough to make Marcus's vision swim when he tried to focus on details. Tall and slender, with skin that held the same pearl luminescence as its craft. Its face carried features that might have been beautiful, or might have been terrible depending on how the light caught them. Large eyes too dark to have depth, a mouth that suggested human proportions without quite achieving them. An overall sense of age compressed into ageless form. But what struck Marcus most was the presence. Not threatening, not malevolent, but carrying weight, as if the being brought with it gravity from somewhere else, bending space and attention around itself simply by existing. The being stood at the edge of its craft and looked at Marcus, and in that gaze, the trucker felt himself seen more completely than at any moment in his 56 years. Not just his physical form, but his history, his loneliness, his unarticulated hunger for meaning. It was like standing naked beneath lights that revealed not just skin but soul. Marcus tried to speak, to ask what this was, what it wanted, but his voice caught in his throat. The being tilted its head, a gesture almost human in its curiosity, and then Marcus felt something that wasn't quite sound and wasn't quite touch, a vibration that started in his chest and spread outward, carrying with it a sense of calm recognition, as if some part of him had been expecting this moment all along. And then images, not like watching a screen or remembering an event, but experiencing directly, as if Marcus's consciousness had been lifted out of his body and shown things from perspectives he'd never imagined. He saw the Earth from space, small and blue and heartbreakingly fragile. He saw the solar system as a vast clockwork, each planet following invisible grooves carved by gravity and time. He saw the Milky Way galaxy as a spiral of light containing billions of worlds, many of them hosting consciousness in forms humans had never conceived. And he saw something else, something that made his breath catch and tears form unbidden in his eyes. He saw Jesus, not the pale European figure from church paintings or the bloodied victim from crucifixes. This Jesus was Middle Eastern, weathered by sun and wind, dressed in the simple clothes of a first-century Jewish carpenter. But he was also more than that. Around and through him, Marcus could see patterns, lines of light connecting to other people, to the earth beneath his feet, to the sky above his head. And those patterns suggested purpose, design, intention, behind a life that history had recorded as miraculous but had never fully explained. The being in the desert was showing him something about Jesus that the official Gospels had never captured, not replacing the familiar stories, but revealing layers beneath them, contexts that changed everything about what those events had meant. Marcus felt himself being drawn deeper into the vision, consciousness expanding to encompass information that had no business fitting inside a human skull. The being was communicating not through language, but through direct transmission of understanding, showing him truths about faith and reality and the nature of consciousness itself. It showed him that Jesus had performed not just the miracles recorded in Scripture, but many others. 7 in particular had been witnessed by multiple people, documented by early followers, and then systematically removed from the official canon by church councils centuries later. Not because they hadn't happened, but because they revealed too much about what Jesus actually was. Not just a messenger from God, but a demonstration of what human consciousness could become when it recognized its true nature. The first erased miracle. Jesus as a child, perhaps 8 years old, shaping birds from clay by a stream. The other children laughed at his sculptures, crude and misshapen, compared to the real sparrows hopping nearby. But Jesus had placed his small hands over the clay, and the children watched as the figures transformed, feathers emerging from packed earth, eyes opening where there had been only indentations, small hearts beginning to beat inside chests that had been solid moments before. The clay birds had spread wings and flown away, chirping with voices that should have been impossible, and the other children had run home terrified to tell their parents about the strange boy who could bring dead things to life. This miracle had been recorded in several early Christian texts, Marcus understood, but removed because it suggested Jesus' power existed from childhood, that it wasn't granted at baptism or acquired through spiritual discipline. It suggested that divinity was inherent in his nature from the beginning, which complicated theological arguments about his humanity and his relationship to God the Father. The second erased miracle, Jesus at 16, working with his father Joseph in the carpenter's shop. A Roman soldier had brought them a table to repair, expensive cedar that had split down the middle when someone drove a sword through it during a drunken rage. Joseph examined the damage and said it couldn't be fixed, that the wood was ruined, but Jesus had placed his hands on either side of the split, and the wood had flowed like water, fibers reconnecting, the break healing as smoothly as if it had never existed. The soldier had taken the table without comment, but word spread through Nazareth about the carpenter's son, who could heal not just bodies, but objects, who could restore wholeness to things the world declared broken. This miracle had been excised because it suggested Jesus' power wasn't limited to healing the faithful or performing signs that pointed toward spiritual truth. It suggested he could alter physical matter at will, which made him seem more like a sorcerer than a savior, more like a threat to natural law than a messenger of supernatural grace. The third erased miracle, Jesus at 23, still years away from beginning his ministry, traveling with a merchant caravan toward Egypt. They'd been crossing the Sinai when bandits attacked, killing 2 guards and scattering the others. The merchants huddled around their goods expecting death or robbery, but Jesus had stood and spoken, not to the bandits, but to the desert itself, and the sand had risen in response, forming a wall between attackers and victims, holding steady despite wind that should have dispersed it, maintaining shape until the bandits fled in terror of magic they couldn't comprehend. This miracle had been removed because it showed Jesus using his power for physical protection, for preventing violence rather than enduring it. Later, church authorities wanted to emphasize his acceptance of suffering, his willingness to die without resistance. A Jesus who could command nature to defend himself complicated the narrative of sacrificial lamb, suggested he chose death rather than being unable to prevent it. Marcus experienced these revelations not as separate stories, but as lived memories, as if he'd been present at each event, watching from angles that allowed him to see not just what happened, but why it mattered. The being was showing him that these weren't just deleted paragraphs from ancient texts. They were keys to understanding what Jesus had actually been demonstrating about the nature of consciousness and reality. The fourth erased miracle. Jesus at 29, 1 year before his baptism, attending a wedding in a town whose name the Gospels never recorded. This wasn't Cana. That came later. This was earlier, quieter, witnessed by fewer people. At this wedding, a child had died. Sudden fever, the kind that took children regularly in a world without antibiotics or modern medicine. The family's grief had overwhelmed the celebration, turning joy to mourning in the space of an afternoon. Jesus had gone to where the child lay, already cooling, already beyond the reach of anything human skill could provide. He'd placed his hand on the small forehead and spoken words in a language that predated Aramaic, that sounded less like prayer and more like command. And the child had gasped, eyes opening, fever-broken, sitting up and asking for food as if waking from ordinary sleep. But here was the detail that got this miracle erased. The child remembered. Unlike Lazarus, who would later be raised from several days dead with no memory of where he'd been, this child spoke of what he'd seen on the other side. He described a place of light, beings made of something other than flesh, and a choice he'd been given: continue forward or return to his body. He'd chosen return, but he brought back knowledge that shouldn't have been possible for a 5-year-old child to articulate. The church councils centuries later decided this miracle was too dangerous. It suggested death wasn't the absolute boundary theology claimed. It suggested consciousness continued in ways that could be perceived, remembered, described. It suggested the afterlife wasn't a distant heaven or hell, but a state of being accessible to awareness prepared to receive it. So the story was removed, labeled apocryphal, quietly disappeared from the official record. The fifth erased miracle. Jesus, at 31, 2 years into his ministry, traveling through Samaria. He'd encountered a woman at a well, not the one recorded in John's Gospel, but a different woman, older, who had lost faith not through sin, but through suffering. Her husband had died. Her children had died. She'd survived when everyone she loved hadn't, and she'd concluded that God, if he existed at all, was cruel or indifferent. Jesus had talked with her for hours, and something in their conversation had broken through her despair. She'd asked if he could prove that death wasn't ending, that her loved ones still existed somewhere. And Jesus had done something the official Gospels never recorded. He'd taken her hand and opened her perception, temporarily expanding her consciousness beyond normal human limitation. For 30 seconds, witnesses later said it felt both instantaneous and eternal, the woman could see as Jesus saw. She perceived the deceased gathered around her, recognizable but transformed, existing in a state that was more real than physical life had ever been. She saw her husband's consciousness, free from the body that had constrained it. She saw her children, no longer suffering, no longer limited by the smallness of their earthly years, and she saw that the love between them hadn't ended, but had actually intensified, purified by release from physical necessity. When her normal vision returned, she collapsed weeping, not from grief but from joy and relief so intense her body couldn't contain it. She became one of Jesus's most devoted followers, speaking everywhere about what she'd been shown. But the church councils decided this miracle made salvation too easy, too accessible. If Jesus could simply show people the afterlife, where was the need for faith? Where was the test that separated believers from skeptics? So this miracle too was removed, preserved only in fragments that later authorities dismissed as mystical exaggeration. The being showed Marcus these events with such clarity that he could smell the dust of ancient roads, could feel the heat of Middle Eastern sun, could sense the presence of consciousness that observed human drama with compassion that transcended human capacity for love. And Marcus understood that he was being shown not just history, but truth, that these miracles had happened, that they'd been witnessed, that they'd been deliberately hidden because they revealed too much about what Jesus actually was and what he was trying to teach. The sixth erased miracle. Jesus, at 32, visiting Jerusalem during one of the pilgrimage festivals. The temple courts were crowded with merchants and money changers, the usual chaos of religious commerce. But in a corner, almost unnoticed by the crowd, sat a man who had been blind from birth, not just physically blind, but mentally limited, unable to speak or understand language, locked inside a mind that had never developed normally. The man's family had brought him to the temple hoping for charity, for enough coins to keep him fed another week. They didn't expect miracles. They'd long since given up hope that their son could ever be more than the damaged creature he appeared to be. Jesus had stopped before him, and the disciples assumed another healing was about to occur. They'd seen him restore sight dozens of times by then, but what happened next was different. Jesus placed his hands on the man's head, and light, actual visible light, flowed from his palms into the man's skull. The crowd nearby stopped their transactions, staring at this impossible luminescence that seemed to be rewiring something fundamental inside the blind man's mind. When Jesus removed his hands, the man opened his eyes that had never functioned, that had been clouded and useless from birth. But more than vision returned. Language came flooding back, or perhaps arrived for the first time. Memory organized itself into coherent structure. Consciousness expanded to fill the full capacity of a human mind that had been operating at a fraction of its potential. The man stood, looked around, and spoke his first words with the fluency of someone who'd been speaking for years. He described what he'd experienced. Not darkness, but a kind of dream state where he'd been aware but unable to interact, locked behind a wall he couldn't break through. And he said Jesus hadn't just healed damage but had rebuilt something fundamental, had reached into the architecture of consciousness itself and corrected errors in its construction. This miracle was erased because it suggested Jesus could do more than heal bodies. He could restructure minds, could alter the fundamental substrate of consciousness. Later, theologians found this uncomfortable. It raised questions about free will, about the nature of the soul, about whether consciousness was gift from God or emergent property of physical brain. Easier to remove the story than wrestle with its implications. The seventh and final erased miracle, Jesus at 33, mere days before his arrest and crucifixion. He'd returned to Bethany where his friends Martha, Mary, and their brother Lazarus lived. Lazarus, whom he'd raised from death months earlier, had gathered a small group of the most devoted followers. Not the 12 disciples, but others who'd seen too much to walk away, who'd been transformed by proximity to something they couldn't name but couldn't deny. In that private gathering, Jesus had done something he never did publicly. He'd shown them the future, not metaphorically, not in parables or prophetic language, but directly, opening a window in time that allowed them to see what was coming. They saw his arrest, his trial, his execution. They saw the resurrection and the ascension, but more than that, they saw further. They saw 2,000 years of history spreading out like a map. They saw Christianity spreading across continents, fracturing into denominations, inspiring both great compassion and terrible violence. They saw the church councils that would edit the Gospels, removing stories like these 7 miracles, shaping doctrine to serve institutional power rather than spiritual truth. They saw the Crusades and the Inquisition, the Reformation and the missionary movements, the slow spread of Jesus' core message filtered through countless interpretations. And they saw the end of the age, not as apocalypse or destruction, but as awakening. They saw humanity reaching a threshold where the consciousness Jesus had demonstrated would become accessible to many, where the miracles that seemed supernatural would be recognized as natural expressions of awareness operating at its full capacity. This final erased miracle was the most dangerous of all. It suggested Jesus knew exactly what would happen to his message, how it would be distorted and weaponized, how institutions would claim his authority while ignoring his actual teachings. It suggested he'd allowed his closest followers to see this future and had asked them to preserve the truth anyway, to keep the pure teaching alive in hidden streams that would eventually resurface when humanity was ready. The church councils removed this miracle completely, destroying every text that mentioned it, because it suggested Jesus had approved of interpretations outside official channels. It suggested the institutional church wasn't the sole guardian of truth, but just one structure among many, sometimes faithful to his message and sometimes tragically opposite to it. Marcus absorbed these 7 revelations like water soaking into parched ground, each one reshaping his understanding not just of Christianity, but of consciousness itself, of what human beings actually were and what they might become. And he understood why the being had chosen to show him this, not because he was special, not because he was particularly faithful or good, but because he was ready, because his emptiness had created space that truth could fill. The being stepped closer, and Marcus could see his own reflection in those dark, bottomless eyes, not just his face, but his essence, his potential, the version of himself he could become if he chose to integrate what he'd been shown. And he felt the question that wasn't quite spoken: what would he do with this knowledge? Would he hide it as the church councils had? Would he share it, despite the cost? Would he allow it to transform him, or would he cling to comfortable smallness? Marcus didn't have answers. Not yet. His mind was still reeling, trying to process revelations that felt both completely alien and strangely familiar, as if some part of him had always known these truths, but needed permission to acknowledge them. The being seemed to understand this. It reached out one long-fingered hand, and Marcus found himself taking it without fear, and in that touch came one final transmission, not information this time, but energy, a recalibration of something fundamental in Marcus's nervous system, his consciousness, his capacity to perceive reality. When the hand withdrew, Marcus gasped. The desert around him looked different, more vivid, more real, as if he'd been viewing the world through smudged glass that had suddenly been cleaned. He could see energy patterns in the air, not hallucinations, but actual structures of electromagnetic force and quantum probability that underlaid physical reality. He could feel the consciousness of other living things, distant coyotes hunting rabbits, insects moving through sand, even bacteria transforming dead matter back into nutrients for new life. His awareness had expanded, and he understood this was just the beginning. The being stepped back, and the pearl light surrounding its form began to intensify. Marcus understood without words that their time together was ending, that the encounter had reached its natural conclusion, but the knowing that had been planted in him would continue growing long after this moment passed. The being returned to its craft, if craft was the right word for something that seemed to exist half in this dimension and half in others. The transparent section sealed, or perhaps simply ceased being transparent, and the entire structure began to lift, not with thrust or propulsion, but by simply deciding to be elsewhere, moving through space the way thought moves through mind, instantaneous and effortless. Marcus watched it ascend until it became a point of light again, then 3 points rearranging themselves into constellation patterns, then nothing but ordinary stars in their ancient configurations. The desert was empty except for himself, his truck, and the highway stretching toward horizons he could no longer think of as merely physical. He stood there for a long time, feeling the night air cool against his skin, listening to silence that no longer felt empty but full, packed with presence and meaning his old awareness simply hadn't been equipped to perceive. When he finally climbed back into his truck cab, his hands were shaking, but not from fear, from possibility, from recognition that the life he'd been living was just one thin slice of a reality far richer and stranger than he'd imagined. He started the engine, pulled back onto the highway, and continued toward Salt Lake City. But everything had changed. The road that had been just asphalt and painted lines now appeared as a river of intention, thousands of journeys layered atop each other, all the consciousness that had traveled this route, leaving traces in the fabric of space itself. His truck was no longer just metal and diesel, but a temporary vessel carrying awareness that would eventually shed this form and continue in others. Dawn came as he crossed into Utah, and Marcus pulled into a truck stop to refuel. The mundane ritual of swiping credit card, pumping diesel, cleaning windshield, all of it felt sacred now, imbued with significance. The teenager working the register, exhausted from night shift, glowed faintly around the edges, his consciousness visible to Marcus's expanded perception as something magnificent, trying to remember what it was while trapped in the story of being just another minimum-wage worker in the middle of nowhere. Marcus wanted to tell him, wanted to grab the kid's shoulders and explain that he was so much more than he appeared, that his life had purpose beyond anything he'd been taught to expect. But he understood that revelation couldn't be forced, that each consciousness awakened in its own time, according to patterns too complex for individual will to alter. So instead, Marcus just smiled, a genuine expression of warmth toward a fellow traveler, and the teenager smiled back, puzzled but pleased by this unexpected connection from a random truck driver at 6 in the morning. Marcus delivered his load to the warehouse outside Salt Lake City, completed his paperwork, and found himself with 3 days off before his next scheduled run. Normally, he'd spend that time in a cheap motel, watching television, sleeping off road fatigue, eating at chain restaurants that all served the same flavorless variations on meat and starch, but nothing about his life was normal anymore. He drove instead to the mountains east of the city, following back roads until he found a campground that was nearly empty this early in the season. He parked, grabbed his sleeping bag, and hiked up a trail that led to a ridge overlooking the valley. There, surrounded by pine trees and stone that had witnessed millennia of human drama, he sat and tried to process what had happened to him. The 7 erased miracles played through his mind, like footage from a film he couldn't pause or rewind. Each one revealed layers of meaning the more he contemplated it. Jesus shaping birds from clay and bringing them to life. That wasn't just miraculous power, it was a demonstration that consciousness could reorganize matter, that the boundary between living and non-living was less absolute than people assumed. Life wasn't something that happened to matter, but something consciousness did with matter when conditions allowed. Jesus healing the split table, showing that restoration was possible, that what the world declared broken and unfixable could be made whole again. Not just objects, but people, relationships, societies. The implication was that fragmentation wasn't the natural state but a temporary condition, and wholeness was always available to those who remembered how to access it. Jesus commanding sand to form defensive walls, revealing that consciousness could interface directly with physical reality, that mind and matter weren't separate substances, but different expressions of the same underlying field. The material world responded to intention, when intention was clear enough, focused enough, freed from doubt about what was possible. Jesus raising the child who remembered the other side, proving death was transition rather than ending, that awareness continued in forms physical senses couldn't normally detect, and more than that, showing that the boundary between life and death was permeable, that communication across that threshold was possible for consciousness that hadn't been taught such communication was impossible. Jesus opening the Samaritan woman's perception, demonstrating that the limitation, preventing humans from seeing the full spectrum of reality, wasn't in reality itself, but in consciousness, in the filters and boundaries that defined normal awareness. Remove those filters temporarily, and the truth became obvious, that the physical world was just one frequency in an infinite spectrum, and loved ones never actually left. They just moved to frequencies outside normal perception. Jesus restructuring the blind man's consciousness, showing that awareness itself could be healed, expanded, corrected, that the mind wasn't fixed hardware, but fluid software, capable of being rewritten when someone with sufficient understanding touched it, that limitations people assumed were permanent, intellectual disability, mental illness, rigid patterns of thought, could potentially be transformed if consciousness was approached from the right angle with the right tools. And Jesus showing his followers the future, revealing that time wasn't the linear river it appeared to be, but something more like an ocean where past and future existed simultaneously with the present, accessible to awareness that learned to navigate outside normal temporal constraints. That history wasn't locked and unchangeable, but influenced by consciousness observing it from multiple temporal positions simultaneously. Each miracle was a key to understanding the nature of reality, and together they formed a map, instructions for how consciousness could operate at levels far beyond what modern humans considered normal. This was what Jesus had actually been teaching, Marcus realized, not just moral lessons about being kind or faithful, but practical demonstrations of what awakened consciousness could accomplish. The church councils had removed these specific miracles because they made salvation too immediate, too accessible, too independent of institutional mediation. If anyone could potentially raise the dead, heal minds, see the future, reshape matter, if these weren't unique divine powers but natural capabilities of consciousness operating at full capacity, then what was the church's role? How could institutions claim authority over spiritual truth if spiritual truth was directly accessible to anyone who expanded their awareness sufficiently? Marcus sat on that mountain ridge as the sun traced its arc across the Utah sky, and he felt something fundamental shifting inside himself, not just his understanding but his actual being. The energy the being had transmitted when they'd touched was still working through his system, restructuring neural pathways, expanding perceptual capacity, clearing blockages that had constrained his consciousness since childhood. He could feel memories surfacing that he'd forgotten or suppressed. His mother singing hymns while cooking breakfast, her voice carrying a quality he'd heard but never consciously registered, a joy that came from somewhere beyond herself, as if she was channeling something larger through her ordinary morning ritual. His father working on car engines in their garage, explaining how each part contributed to the whole, unconsciously teaching Marcus about interconnection and purpose. Even Sharon, his ex-wife, appeared differently in memory now. He'd thought she left because she couldn't handle his absence, couldn't tolerate being married to someone who was never home. But now he could see another layer. She'd left because his presence had become hollow, because he'd been running from something he couldn't name, and that running had created an emptiness no amount of time together could have filled. She'd tried to reach him, tried to break through the walls he'd built, and when she finally accepted she couldn't, she'd chosen her own survival over continued attempts to save someone who didn't want saving. Marcus felt tears on his face, but they weren't tears of grief. They were release, decades of accumulated tension and suppression and unarticulated longing finally finding exit. He'd been so lonely, he realized. Not just alone, which was a circumstantial state, but lonely, which was a soul condition, disconnected from himself, from others, from the larger consciousness that the being had shown him was the true nature of existence. But that loneliness was ending. Not because his circumstances had changed. He was still sitting alone on a mountain, still had no family, still lived a life of transient solitude, but because his understanding had transformed. He wasn't separate anymore, wasn't isolated. He was part of something infinite, connected to every other consciousness through threads too subtle for normal perception, but absolutely real to awareness that had learned to sense them. As the sun began setting, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose, Marcus understood what he needed to do. Not dramatically, not with some grand gesture or life-changing decision, just differently. He needed to drive his truck differently, seeing each journey as sacred rather than simply economic. He needed to interact with people differently, recognizing the divine spark in every clerk and mechanic and waitress he encountered. He needed to carry this knowing quietly, allowing it to emanate from him naturally, rather than trying to convince others through words or argument. He would become what the being had been for him, a presence that reminded others of what they'd forgotten, a living demonstration that reality was stranger and more wonderful than the stories culture told about it. Marcus hiked back to his truck. As stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had moved to announce the being's arrival. They looked ordinary now, locked in their expected positions, but he knew better. He knew that behind the appearance of fixed points in a mechanical universe, consciousness was watching, guiding, loving its own manifestations with a patience and compassion beyond human capacity to fully grasp. He drove back towards Salt Lake City, and as the highway descended from mountains into valley, he made a decision. He would continue driving trucks. It was honest work, and it took him to places where he might encounter others ready for the kind of awakening he'd experienced, but he would also begin writing down what he'd been shown, not as theology or doctrine, but as story. He would preserve the 7 erased miracles in language that honored their mystery, while making them accessible to modern readers who'd been taught to dismiss miracles as superstition or metaphor. The next morning, Marcus bought a notebook at a bookstore in downtown Salt Lake City, simple spiral-bound paper, nothing fancy. And sitting in a coffee shop that would have been unremarkable to anyone else, but glowed with the consciousness of dozens of customers and staff, all playing their roles in the vast drama of existence, he began to write. He wrote about Jesus as a child, shaping clay into birds, and breathing life into matter that shouldn't have been capable of containing it. He wrote about the carpenter's son healing a broken table, demonstrating that restoration was always possible. He wrote about the young man commanding sand to rise as shield, showing that consciousness could interface directly with physical reality. The words flowed without effort, as if he was remembering rather than creating, as if the being had left these stories encoded in his nervous system, and he was simply translating them into English. Hours passed without his awareness. Coffee cooled in his cup. The staff changed shifts, and still Marcus wrote, filling page after page with accounts that had been hidden for 2,000 years. He wrote about the child raised from death who remembered the other side, about the woman whose perception was temporarily expanded to see her deceased loved ones, about the blind man whose consciousness was restructured and healed. And finally, he wrote about Jesus showing his closest followers the future, revealing that his message would be distorted and weaponized, but trusting that truth would persist in hidden streams until humanity was ready to receive it fully. When Marcus finally set down his pen, the sun was setting again. He'd been writing for nearly 10 hours, sustained by something other than food or caffeine. The notebook was half filled with handwriting that looked more purposeful than his usual scrawl, as if his hand had been guided by intelligence that knew exactly how these stories needed to be told. He read through what he'd written, and satisfaction settled over him. This was right. This was what he was meant to do with what he'd been shown. Not preach, not start a movement, not claim special authority. Just preserve and share, allowing the stories to work on whoever encountered them according to their readiness and need. Marcus spent the next 2 days refining the text, adding context, shaping it into something that could stand alone without explanation. And when he was satisfied it was complete, he drove to a library and used their computer to type it all into a document. He saved it to a flash drive, then created an email account under a pseudonym and began sending the text to small religious websites, alternative spirituality forums, anyone who might be open to receiving it. He didn't claim it was absolute truth. He presented it as something he'd been shown, something that resonated with his own experience, something others could evaluate for themselves. Some who read it would dismiss it as fiction or heresy. Others would feel the same recognition Marcus had felt when the being showed him these events, the sense of truth that transcended proof or evidence, that spoke directly to consciousness, ready to remember what it had always known. When his 3 days off ended, Marcus returned to his truck and his roots, but he carried the notebook with him, adding to it when new insights came. He began noticing patterns he'd never perceived before, how certain routes took him past places where he'd encounter specific people who needed exactly what he could offer in that moment. Not magical thinking or coincidence, but something more like alignment, consciousness arranging circumstances so that meetings happened when they needed to, that lessons were delivered when readiness allowed them to be received. In a diner outside Reno, he met a woman whose son had died in a car accident 3 years prior. She sat in the booth next to his, and he felt the weight of her grief like physical pressure in the air. Without planning it, without rehearsal, Marcus found himself turning to her and saying that death wasn't ending, that consciousness continued, that her son still existed in forms she couldn't see with physical eyes, but could absolutely feel with the deeper perception everyone possessed, if they learned to access it. She'd looked at him with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope, and he'd told her about the fourth erased miracle, the child raised from death who remembered the other side. He didn't claim authority or special knowledge, just shared the story as something that had meaning for him and might have meaning for her. The woman listened with tears streaming down her face, and when Marcus finished, she thanked him, said she didn't know if she believed him, but something about the story had loosened the grip of grief that had been strangling her for 3 years. She said she'd think about what he'd told her, would try to feel her son's presence instead of just mourning his absence. Marcus drove away from that encounter knowing he'd done what he was supposed to do, not convinced her, not saved her, just offered a different perspective that might help her navigate suffering that had seemed unbearable. Similar encounters happened regularly now. The mechanic in Boise, whose faith had crumbled after his church covered up abuse. The truck stop attendant in Wyoming, who'd been having dreams about lights in the sky and beings that seemed to carry messages she couldn't quite remember when she woke. The retired teacher in Montana, who'd been researching early Christianity and felt frustrated by how much seemed to be missing from official accounts. To each, Marcus shared appropriate pieces of what he'd been shown, sometimes just one of the 7 erased miracles, sometimes the broader context about consciousness and reality, always calibrated to what they could receive, always offered without pressure or insistence, and gradually Marcus noticed he was changing, not just his understanding, but his actual physical presence. The expanded awareness the being had activated in him was stabilizing, becoming his new baseline rather than a temporary enhancement. He could see energy patterns around people, could sense their emotional states, could feel the health or disease in their bodies, like variations in temperature or texture in the air around them. Twice he'd helped people by simply describing what he perceived. A man complaining of mysterious stomach pain that doctors couldn't diagnose. Marcus could see a darkness in his abdomen that suggested blockage or inflammation. He'd suggested the man insist on more comprehensive testing, and 2 weeks later the man tracked him down to say they'd found a tumor, caught early enough to remove successfully. The woman whose teenage daughter had become withdrawn and uncommunicative. Marcus could see the girl was experiencing depression so severe it was affecting her energy field, creating a gray pallor that physical eyes couldn't detect, but expanded awareness could. He gently suggested the mother seek mental health support, and months later received an email thanking him for possibly saving her daughter's life. Marcus wasn't healing people directly. He didn't have that level of capacity, at least not yet. But his enhanced perception allowed him to see things others missed, and that information, delivered at the right time, could make crucial differences in outcomes. 6 months after his encounter in the Nevada desert, Marcus's life had become something he couldn't have imagined in his previous existence. Still driving trucks, still solitary in his daily routine, but profoundly connected in ways that transcended physical proximity. He felt part of a network, other people who'd had similar awakenings, who carried similar knowing, who were quietly working to shift human consciousness toward the threshold Jesus had been trying to show humanity 2,000 years ago. He began to understand that the being who'd contacted him wasn't unique. Others were having similar encounters, receiving similar revelations. The phenomenon was accelerating, as if some cosmic timetable had reached a critical point where mass awakening became possible in ways it hadn't been during previous eras. Marcus found forums online where people shared their experiences, encounters with beings who claimed to be extraterrestrial, but taught spiritual truths that aligned perfectly with core messages from Earth's wisdom traditions. Some described beings of light who showed them the interconnected nature of all consciousness. Others reported meetings with entities who revealed that human religious figures, Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, Krishna, had all been expressions of the same cosmic intelligence, teaching the same fundamental lessons through different cultural frameworks. The consistency across these independent accounts was striking. Thousands of people, scattered across the globe, reporting nearly identical information received from sources they couldn't easily explain. Not delusion or mental illness, but a genuine phenomenon that mainstream science and religion both struggled to accommodate. Marcus began corresponding with some of these experiences, sharing his own story about the 7 erased miracles. The responses were immediate and powerful. Many said the miracles he described resonated deeply, felt true in ways they couldn't articulate, but absolutely recognized. Others reported having dreams or visions about similar events, Jesus performing wonders that weren't in the Bible, demonstrating capabilities that suggested something far more profound than traditional theology acknowledged. One woman in particular, a former Catholic nun named Teresa, reached out with information that made Marcus's breath catch. She said that during her years in the convent, she'd been granted access to restricted archives, ancient texts the church kept but didn't publicize. And there, in fragments deemed too controversial for general circulation, she'd found references to the exact miracles Marcus had described: the clay birds, the healed table, the sand walls, all documented in texts that church authorities had labeled heretical or unreliable. Teresa said she'd been waiting years for someone to bring these stories back into public awareness. She said Marcus's account, claimed to come from an extraterrestrial source, might actually give these historical miracles more credibility than if they'd been presented through traditional religious channels. People who'd learned to distrust institutional Christianity might be more open to receiving truth from alternative sources. Marcus wasn't sure how he felt about that irony. That ancient Christian truth might be more acceptable when delivered by someone claiming alien contact than when presented as church history. But he couldn't deny the logic. The church had lost credibility through centuries of corruption and cover-up. Alternative sources, even strange ones, might be perceived as more trustworthy. As winter approached again, nearly a year after his encounter, Marcus found himself driving through Nevada again, passing near the spot where everything had changed. He pulled off the highway at the same location, parked in the same position, and stood under stars that had resumed their normal behavior, distant, fixed, indifferent to human observation. But Marcus knew better. He knew consciousness was watching from behind those points of light, that intelligence vast beyond human comprehension was guiding evolution across countless worlds, nurturing awareness wherever it emerged, patiently waiting for species to reach the threshold where they could join the larger community of awakened consciousness that populated the cosmos. He thought about Jesus, about what those 7 erased miracles revealed about his true nature and mission. Jesus hadn't been God pretending to be human, or human claiming to be God. He'd been something more subtle and more radical, human consciousness operating at full capacity, demonstrating what the species could become when it shed the limitations of fear and separation and remembered its true nature. The miracles weren't violations of natural law, but expressions of natural law operating at levels most humans never accessed. Consciousness could shape matter, because consciousness and matter were both expressions of the same underlying field. Death could be reversed, because death wasn't ending but transition, and transitions could flow in multiple directions. The future could be perceived, because time wasn't the rigid sequence it appeared to be, but a landscape that awareness could navigate from multiple positions simultaneously. And Jesus had been trying to teach this, not that people should worship him, but that they should become like him, not in personality or biography, but in capacity. He'd been demonstrating the graduate level of human development, showing what consciousness could accomplish when it transcended the limitations that culture and biology imposed. The church had preserved his moral teachings: love one another, forgive enemies, care for the vulnerable. All important, all valuable. But the church had hidden or eliminated the demonstrations of power, the examples of what awakened consciousness could actually do, because those demonstrations threatened institutional authority, suggested that intermediaries between human and divine were unnecessary, implied that salvation wasn't something granted by hierarchy, but something achieved through individual development. Marcus stood in that Nevada darkness, and he felt gratitude, not directed at any particular deity or being, but just radiating outward as a state of being. Gratitude for the encounter that had cracked open his limited awareness. Gratitude for the vision of Jesus that transcended the small god of institutional religion. Gratitude for consciousness itself, for the mystery of existing, for being part of something so vast and strange and beautiful that human language could barely touch its edges. A shooting star traced across the sky, just a meteor, just rock and ice burning up in Earth's atmosphere. But Marcus perceived it differently now, saw it as a symbol, a reminder that even the smallest fragments of matter carried significance when viewed from the right perspective, that nothing in the universe was wasted, that every consciousness, every experience, every moment of suffering or joy contributed to the larger pattern of evolution unfolding across eons and light years. He climbed back into his truck and continued his journey, not knowing where the road would ultimately lead, but trusting that the same intelligence that had guided him to that desert encounter would continue guiding him toward whatever was next, toward people who needed what he carried, toward experiences that would deepen his understanding, toward the moment when human consciousness collectively reached the threshold Jesus had been indicating, when the miracles that seemed supernatural would become natural expressions of what humans had always been capable of, but had forgotten how to access. Marcus drove through the darkness with his expanded awareness, perceiving layers of reality invisible to normal sight, and he understood something profound. The second coming wasn't an external event where Jesus physically returned in clouds and glory. It was an internal event, a shift in human consciousness, where enough people awakened to their true nature that collective reality transformed. Jesus wasn't coming back. Jesus was emerging from within, as the human species gradually remembered what it actually was and began operating at the level of capacity he'd demonstrated 2 millennia ago. The 7 erased miracles were keys to that remembering, not just interesting historical footnotes, but instruction manual for consciousness evolution. Each one showed a different aspect of what awakened awareness could accomplish. Together they formed a map for transcending the limitations that had always been self-imposed, maintained by belief in separation and smallness and powerlessness. Marcus understood his role now, not to convince anyone or build a following, but simply to preserve and share these stories, allowing them to work on whoever encountered them. Some would dismiss them as fiction, some would be intrigued but uncertain, and some would feel the same shock of recognition Marcus had felt, the sense that these miracles revealed truth about consciousness that had been deliberately hidden but never forgotten, just waiting for the moment when humanity was ready to receive it again. The road stretched ahead, illuminated by headlights that pushed back darkness for a few dozen yards, but Marcus's awareness extended far beyond that small circle of visibility. He could feel the network of consciousness surrounding him, other awakened individuals, other beings working toward the same goal of collective evolution, other expressions of the same intelligence that had worn the being's form in the Nevada desert. He was not alone, had never been alone, even in his years of self-imposed isolation, and neither was anyone else, though most hadn't yet developed the capacity to perceive the connections that existed beneath the illusion of separation. That was changing. The veil was thinning, the cosmic timetable was accelerating, and Marcus was honored to play whatever small role consciousness had assigned him in the transformation unfolding across his species and his world. Perhaps heaven had never been above anyone, he thought, as dawn approached and the first light touched the eastern horizon. Perhaps heaven had always been the state of awareness that emerged when fear dissolved and consciousness remembered what it actually was, not separate, not small, not powerless, but infinite and interconnected and capable of miracles that would make the 7 erased events seem ordinary by comparison. Perhaps the sky had many names, and Jesus was just one of them. Perhaps truth couldn't be contained by any single tradition or institution, but flowed like water, finding whatever channels were open to receive it. Perhaps the alien in the desert and the carpenter from Nazareth were both expressions of the same eternal consciousness, teaching the same lessons through different forms, always present, always guiding, always waiting for awareness to expand enough to recognize what had always been obvious to those who learned to see. Marcus drove into the sunrise, carrying his knowing like treasure, and somewhere in the vast spaces between stars, the being watched with satisfaction as another consciousness took its small step toward awakening, contributing its thread to the larger tapestry that was slowly, patiently, inevitably weaving itself toward completion. Truth or fiction, perhaps even the storyteller doesn't know. Here, stories exist to touch you and make you reflect. The magical only reveals itself to those who allow themselves to feel, not to those who insist on seeking certainties.